Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, your community for rational scientific skepticism from a secular humanist perspective. We have questions for today's top answers. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member of the Centre for Inquiry Canada. Welcome. Today I'll be talking with Catherine Francis, who holds a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Law degrees from the University of Toronto and was called to the Ontario Bar in 1987. Catherine is a longtime partner at Minden Gross LLP, a mid-sized downtown Toronto law firm, practicing principally in the areas of commercial and insolvency litigation. Catherine was raised in a secular household with a strong belief in equality rights and is keenly interested in legal issues affecting the interests of non-believers and the separation of church and state. I talk today with Catherine about Quebec's Bill 21, from its introduction in the National Assembly in Quebec through to the numerous court challenges that it faced, the current status of them, including the decision by the Quebec Superior Court in April 2021. We talk about her opposition to the bill and why she thinks it's bad for secularism and bad for Canada. We discuss the split between Quebec and the rest of Canada, as well as the split within Canada's secular community. We explore some of the arguments in favor of Bill 21 and why she finds them unconvincing. I think it's a fascinating conversation, and I'm delighted you've decided to join us today. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Catherine Francis about Bill 21. Hello, Catherine. Thanks very much for taking the time with us today to talk to us. We're going to be talking about Quebec's Bill 21, what it is, its history, and the impact that it has on Quebecers and what is potentially in store for it in the future. So thanks for lending your expertise and taking the time out today. Just to start off, do you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in this and why this is important to you?
All right, thank you. And thank you for having me, Leslie. So I'm a lawyer practicing in Ontario. I've been practicing since my call to the bar in 1987. This isn't really my area of practice, but I'm interested in constitutional matters, and I'm particularly interested in, I guess I'd say, human rights matters and issues related to this specific bill, religious freedom and freedom from religion. So, and I belong to a number of secular organizations, and that's really how I got interested in this bill.
Then you're no stranger to Quebec's history in this. This isn't Bill 21. Is not the first time that it's attempted to legislate secularism. A few years ago, it had the Secularism Charter, and then there's Bill 21, which is often referred to as its secularism law. Can you provide a little bit of history of secularism in Quebec, or rather, the attempts to legislate Quebec's interpretation of secularism?
I don't have a lot of history before the introduction of Bill 21, other than of course, Quebec had a long history of schools, for example, being run by the Catholic Church. And, an attempt to get past that and to become a more secular state. But I really have only kind of looked back at the beginning of the efforts to bring this bill into place, which was part of the agenda of Francois Legault when his party won in, I think it was 2018. This was part of his platform, which was to bring in the secular bill.
All right, so then let's just talk about Bill 21. Can you tell me, what does it contain? What is its scope? What does it allow? What does it prohibit? Can you tell me, what's in it so that we know what we're talking about?
Okay, so I won't go into every aspect of the bill, but I think the main and the controversial aspects of the bill, which
Sure.
is, and it's called, and I'll just read it out, an act respecting the laicity, I hope I said that right, of the estate. of the state, and it's to affirm the laicity of the state and set out the requirements that will follow it. And it's based on, if I could just read out the principles: separation of state and religions, the religious neutrality of the state, equality of all citizens, and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. So it has some good purposes, and the question is really, does it actually adhere to those purposes?
What does it do?
Yeah. So what it does, sorry. So what it does is prohibits certain people, not everyone. There's a lot of exemptions, but certain people in official positions from wearing religious symbols while they're exercising those functions. It, in simple terms, it it is mostly it refers to all religious symbols, but in practice, it mostly applies to various kinds of headgear, if I can put it that way. I mean, it applies to crosses. It's applies to wearing a cross on a chain around your neck, but it also applies to the hijab. It applies to the kippah and applies to turbans. So it's those kinds of so-called religious symbols, because I'm not even entirely sure that they are really religious symbols, but that's what it's mostly geared toward.
Okay, and who is affected by this? Like, is it all civil servants? Is it anyone that works for the government?
The people who are affected: President and Vice President of the National Assembly, Justices of the Peace, various commissioners, government lawyers, and prosecutors. So, not all lawyers, only government lawyers and prosecutors. Quebec peace officers, and the big one, principals, vice principals, and teachers. So I say big one, it's really, teachers, I would say, are probably most affected. In the initial stages, I think there was actually talk of adding, for example, doctors, and they were left out because that would have affected probably Jewish doctors who wore the kippah, and that could have caused a problem in terms of doctors leaving the province. So they were left out. Not really a rational reason, other than you know
Okay,
probably the sense, and I hate to say this, is that it's focused more on the hijab and more on women, if I can put it that way.
right. Okay, so there's no question that Bill 21 has been quite controversial from the moment it was introduced and remains so to this day. And the Quebec government clearly understood that because it invoked what's known as the notwithstanding clause even before just as part of the legislation before it was challenged because I guess they suspected it would be. Can you talk about what the with notwithstanding clause is and what effect it's had on the legislation in its fairly brief history?
Absolutely. So the notwithstanding clause was part of a compromise that um, was developed back in 1982 with the Charter of Rights. And so it's not restricted to Quebec, it's any province, and the federal government can invoke the notwithstanding clause to say that the legislation applies, notwithstanding that it may violate certain provisions of the charter, and not all provisions, but certain provisions of the Charter of Rights. And the main reason why it was brought in was to get Quebec to sign on to the Constitution. So it's not restricted to Quebec; any province can use it, but
Hmm.
that was the lever to get Quebec to sign on to the Constitution. From what I understand, or to sign on to the Charter of Rights. Sorry, from what I understand is afterward, Quebec actually regularly invoked the notwithstanding clause in all legislation, whether it was considered to violate the charter or not. The thought at the time, and certainly with respect to the federal government and other provinces, was that it would be invoked very sparingly, that it would be a huge political move to do so. It's time limited, it only applies for 5 years, and then it has to be renewed. And most provinces and federal government have not invoked it, although the Ontario government has recently done so,
Hmm.
uh, once or twice, once threatened and once done it. But it is rare outside of Quebec. So I wouldn't actually say that they invoked it because they knew it violated the charter. They would have invoked it anyway. But in this case, it very clearly does violate the charter, so they had to invoke the notwithstanding clause. It would never have survived without it.
Okay, so you made an interesting comment. You said that you just said that it very clearly does invoke the charter. So that's kind of a judgment, and this law was challenged, legally speaking, pretty much as soon as it passed. So it had kind of a two-track challenge through the Quebec court system, and one of those tracks went to the Supreme Court, at least briefly. Can you tell us like what happened, what the challenges were, and what the results were, and where we stand today with respect to Bill 21?
Sure. Okay. So the challenges had to be creative challenges, if I could put it that way, because of the invocation of the notwithstanding clause, uh, uh, the challengers had to find some other way to challenge it. So,
Mhm.
and I can't give all of them. Some of them were so creative that they just made no sense. That it, to me, so I can't even respond to them. But one of them was actually ultimately successful in the decision of the Superior Court of Quebec that came out in April. So I guess I can't say it's a nothing. That one had to do with English language school board rights, that it violated their rights to hire who they wanted to hire as teachers. So and language rights are not caught by the notwithstanding clause. The other one, when it first came out, I actually was thinking the lawyers were very creative, and then when I researched the history, I discovered that it was actually by invitation of, I think, the Quebec Court of Appeal, which is that there's a little known section of the charter that guarantees rights between men and women, and that is not within the ambit of the notwithstanding clause. In other words, those rights cannot be overruled. So
Mhm.
the challenge was that it violated um, rights between men and women because of the disproportionate impact on women wearing the hijab. So I thought that was creative, but then it turned out it was actually an invitation by the judges to to raise that argument.
So the ruling you mentioned came out in April this year at the Quebec Superior Court level. Can you tell us? What the results were, and what the arguments of the Quebec province, the province of Quebec, were in defending Bill 21? What the arguments were, kind of against it, and how they got around the notwithstanding clause, and what the judgment is. So what the ruling ultimately stands, and where we are today.
I will confess at first, I haven't read the ruling because it's in French, and my French is not up to um, reading. It was, I think, over 200 pages long. It's not up to reading something that complicated. But obviously, the province of Quebec, because they had invoked again the notwithstanding clause, said that even if it violated the Charter of Rights, it was still valid legislation, and the court should not interfere. And by and large, the judge agreed, but with respect to the English language school board, the legislation was struck down.
So basically, Bill 21 applies to pretty much all French speaking teachers in the public school system in Quebec. But if you teach in the English language school system, the restrictions on religious headgear and other restrictions from the bill do not apply.
That's correct.
Right.
I was going to say one thing I forgot to mention in terms of the restriction is that there was a so-called a grandfather clause, so that people who were already teachers or in those positions before the bill came into effect in 2019 got to keep their jobs.
Mhm.
Nobody was fired as a result, but they can't be promoted, and they
Right.
can't necessarily move laterally. So that's
So you're stuck in this one role for as long as you want to, but you can't transfer to another school. You can't get promoted, and if you're not already in the French language system, you can't get hired. If you insist on wearing a crucifix or a hijab or a yarmulke or something,
Yeah, that's
or,
right.
or a
And of
turban.
course, as assuming the ruling is under appeal on both sides, then the English language exception may not remain
Right.
once this gets to a higher level of court.
So where does it go next, right? Because the only people from the reports that I read, the only people that were happy with this decision were the what was the English language school boards of Quebec. They thought it was great. Everyone else, whether they were representing French teachers or the state or the province of Quebec, seemed very unhappy with the decision. So, what happens next, and what's likely to happen, after that?
Well, next is the Quebec Court of Appeal, and just to backtrack a little bit, it's already been to the Quebec Court of Appeal, so it's been through a round because it went up to the Quebec Court of Appeal on an interim stay motion.
Okay, so what's an interim state motion?
Okay, that was to stay the legislation pending the court challenge. So and I'm trying to remember. It's a bit of a blur with COVID. I think that was went up in early 2020,
Okay,
possibly late 2019.
so this was we think it's unconstitutional. The province thinks it is constitutional. We're challenging that, but that's going to take time. So, in the interim, until we determine whether this law is constitutional or not, that's going to take a year, maybe 2 years. Who knows? The law system takes time. In the interim, we think that said the appellants that we think that this law is so bad that we want you to stop the province from enforcing it. Don't let it take effect until you, the courts, determine whether it's constitutional or not. Is that a fair summary of?
That's more or less it. It was a preliminary injunction to prevent it going into effect, so that people um, wouldn't be forced. For example, teachers who wanted a job in Quebec wouldn't have to leave the province in order to get a job, or remove their headgear. Of course, I mean, obviously
Right.
choices. So it went to the Quebec Court of Appeal, and interestingly, it was a 2-1 split. So 3 judges heard it, and the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal actually would have granted the injunction, and she was overruled by the other 2 judges.
Okay.
So and she would have done so on the basis of the equality, um, between the sexes. That's what I recall. I haven't reread the decision recently, and then leave was sought to the Supreme Court of Canada. Um, I kind of thought the Supreme Court would give leave. It seemed like the kind of case that,
When you say give leave, that means that they will hear the appeal to stay the legislation until it's weighed on its constitutional merits.
yeah, sorry, jumping at that, I should explain. There are very few cases that where there is an automatic right to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. Who wants to go to the Supreme Court has to file an application for leave to go there, and it's heard by 3 judges of the Supreme Court, and they issue a decision, yay or nay. They never give reasons.
Okay.
They just say yes or no, and they only generally it's fewer than 10% of cases that seek leave actually get it, but this
Hmm.
seemed like one of the cases that would have attracted leave, but possibly because it was only interim and they knew it would be coming back to them later, they did not do so, and they did not give reasons, so we don't know why. And
Okay.
that left it to go off to trial, which again took place in 2020, and was reserved for several months. So indeed, it's been a slow process. It was as was exactly anticipated.
Okay. So, thank you, Catherine. That I think that sets the stage. I'd like to sort of shift our focus a little bit from the history and the facts of Bill 21, and a little bit more around your opinion of it, and your thoughts. So, I know that you consider yourself, you said earlier that you consider yourself to be a secularist, and secular issues are important to you. So, can you define secularism for me, and why you support it?
First of all, I am a non-religious person. Whether you use the term, atheist, humanist, agnostic,
Hmm.
or whatever, I'm not a fan of religion. I'm certainly a fan of separation of church and state. I do not like the idea of the government or state having any control or say over religion. And our Charter of Rights very specifically enshrines freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. And I interpret that, and well, it means more than just freedom of what religion you practice. It's freedom not to have a religion. So secularity to me is an absolute separation of church and state, and an absolute freedom of
Okay.
conscience. Not having any religion thrust down your throat. Put it that way.
That sounds fine. Um, but that leaves me perhaps a little bit confused as to why then you would oppose Bill 21. When you read the purposes of the bill, the principles on which it was founded, you described them as sorry, I forget the exact word, but as noble or at least as good things that you agreed with, and you just told me that you are strongly in favor of a strict separation of church and state and not having the government ram religion down anybody's throat. So these are the arguments that I hear all the time in favor of Bill 21. What Bill 21 does is prevent people, teachers, members of the government, the people that work for and therefore implicitly represent the government, from explicitly or even implicitly showing adherence to a particular faith, which might mean that that might carry an implicit stamp of approval from the state for the crucifix or the hijab or the kippah. So why is it that you would oppose a secularism law that seems to be based on principles that you approve of and has the effect that you like of strict separation between church and state?
Well, that's really an excellent question. And when I first learned of Bill 21, I spent a lot of time um, delving into it and trying to figure out what my opinion would be of it. And it was only after looking at it really, really carefully that I came to the decision that I did not like it and that I did not think it's right. So first of all, I just say I've always been a little bit suspicious. Premier Legault, who brought this in and brought in this platform, at the same time he was campaigning for this, was campaigning for more money to restore churches, etc. And he's, openly professes to be Catholic. So to me, it's not really coming from, a perspective of someone who is non-religious. It's coming from the perspective of someone who is Catholic. And there's a very strong sense that this is really not about getting rid of crosses, jewelry with crosses on them. I mean, there's a very strong sense that is aimed at ethnic minorities. So in that sense, I don't really see it as coming from the place that it's said to be come from. I see it as coming from the place of the Catholic religion, which is not something I'm particularly fond of. So there's a bit of hypocrisy to it. I should say, I'll just say, I would be quite in favor of something saying you shouldn't have nuns in habits teaching our children. And that would actually bother me. So maybe that's inconsistent. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is freedom of religion and conscience means everyone should have those freedoms. And for any government to be telling you what you can and cannot wear, and making a decision as to the significance of what you wear, bothers me. I mean, a hijab, it's a scarf. I could go in and wear a scarf. It wouldn't have any religious significance. Somebody else is deciding that scarf is a religious symbol as opposed to a symbol of, say, modesty, which happens to go along with a particular religion. So I don't like the idea of the government deciding that what you wear has particular religious significance. Um, I don't. I think that's the opposite of what they're trying to do, having a law saying what you can and cannot wear. Um, and next, of course, is, well, of course, it does clearly violate the charter. So I'm really not in favor of anything that violates what I consider to be fundamental human rights. And then finally, the way the charter is designed, it involves a balancing. You can violate rights if There's what's called Section 1 of the Charter. If it can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society, and that involves a balancing. And for the life of me, I can't figure out the harm
Okay.
of a teacher having a headscarf or of a Sikh wearing a turban
Okay.
or Orthodox Jewish man wearing a kippah. How does that actually cause any harm?
Let me provide an argument to you for you said yourself a few moments ago that you would be deeply uncomfortable or at least against a nun in a habit teaching children in a public school system. Young children are impressionable. They look at their elders, at authority figures, and tend to absorb that. And religious garb is or can be seen as a form of advertising and possibly even proselytization. So this might be an example of the reasonable limits that you just quoted from the charter, as can be demonstrably demonstrated in a free and democratic society. If we embrace secular government, which I believe you do and I do, and as supporters of Bill 21 do or consistently claim to do so, why not ask all public servants to represent that secularism and prevent the harm of a indoctrinating. Indoctrinating might be too strong a term. That might not be, depending on your perspective, but certainly of influencing our children in classrooms, and also sort of a broader, more subtler harm of having public servants imply a blessing of the state, a blessing of the province for the religious sentiments that the garb represents.
Okay. Well, I think that goes back to, first of all, the particular garb do not, to me, represent either proselytizing or religious sentiments. And if teachers, for example, are indeed proselytizing, that's a different issue. And so what should be prevented is the proselytizing and not the wearing of of a particular piece of clothing. And who should be deciding that? I mean, if an Indian woman wears a sari, there's no religious significance to that. Are they going to ban that too because it's not Western garb? I I just don't see it, and I don't see that there is any proselytizing that goes along with it. A burqa would be different. I mean, and that I can understand more. It's just that there's not really harm here, and you know, it's I guess it's the impact that bothers me the most is that it's really saying, and there was a message when they enacted this, as or when he campaigned and followed through on the campaign, which is we want less immigration. And the message is we want less immigration of people from particular places. And this is one way of doing it, is to say, you're not welcome in this province. Um, and that's the message. So yeah, if people were indeed, proselytizing, I think that's
Yeah,
a
I don't
different
think
issue.
I
And
don't think even opponents. I don't think that there's any opponent of Bill 21 that I've seen that would be in favor of proselytizing in the classroom. I think that or explicit proselytizing. That's I think that anyone would be against that. But the argument of those in favor of Bill 21 is that religious gear is implicitly doing so, and we need to protect our children our children from that. Uh, Bill 21 is popular in Quebec. A strong majority support it within the province, and but it's deeply unpopular outside the province. Uh, what do you think accounts for that? Accounts for that perspective? Is there something unique about Bill 21 that accounts for that, or is this just another example of the great divide between Anglo and Franco Canadians?
well, actually, I don't really know the answer, other than I don't think any province other than Quebec could even think about doing this. Is Quebec more? I hate to. I know it's a loaded term. I hate to use it, but I'm going to say, is there's sort of this subtext of racism in the popularity. But on the other hand, I mean, it could be popular out of ignorance. I don't know. If the sole bill said you can't wear Catholic symbols, would it be as popular? That's just kind of mooting that question. If it weren't aimed at, you know, foreigners, if I could put it that way, would it be as popular? I'm not sure. On the other hand, I will acknowledge, though, that it's actually also popular with non religious women of Muslim backgrounds who maybe are legitimately concerned about.
So let's talk about this for a moment. I have been a member of the secular community in at least in Toronto, and I've tried to within Canada for about a decade and a half now. And I have never seen an issue that has split the secular community in this country the way Bill 21 is. Uh, uh, there might be other motivations involved, but I have spoken with many committed secularists that are vehemently opposed to Bill 21, and many others who are just as vehemently in favor of it. And if anything, Bill 21 doesn't go far enough in enforcing the noble goals. Like we all, everyone agrees that the principles on which it is founded is noble, but there's a tremendous split within the secular community as to whether Bill 21 is a good bill or a bad bill. So, not talking about English Canada or French Canada, but just within the secular community, what do you think is causing this enormous rift? Where usually there's some discussion about subtleties, but rarely is there so stark a break within the secular community in Canada.
I think there's a number of different factors at play, and you'd have to look at what the different groups. I mean, there are definitely secular groups, very strong atheists who would love to have an eradication of religion, and I kind of agree with that. And what they see this as is it's a good start. It's nowhere near there, but boy, if we can just continue along this path, we will get rid of religion in society, which is, it's to me that's not a totally bad
Mm-hmm.
goal. Um, and then there are, say, women from Islamic countries who've, maybe come to Canada to get away from the fundamentalism, and they see that the hijab, for example, is a symbol of oppression. And perhaps if you ban it, then girls will not see that as a role model, and you know female teachers won't feel obliged to wear one, and will remove them so that they're liberating women. Those are people coming from very different places. And then, of course, perhaps Catholics who are happy for it because, other people may not want to come and resettle in Quebec if they can't wear their religious symbols. So, you know, so those are like three completely different groups of
Right.
people who would favor Bill 21. So
So if I can summarize, you're saying that there's uh, not just non-believers, but like anti-theists, people who are against not like what you were stating earlier is that you don't want government dominating religion or religion dominating government, but the anti-theist position is we want to squelch religion because of all the various harms that it does. And then you've got a group of people you identified, essentially ex-Muslim women who who are anti-theist because they view the hijab as a symbol of oppression because they felt oppressed from their experience, and so they would be in favor of the law, um, or because it's at least a step in the right direction of not normalizing or even implicitly condoning what what that represents, which to them is a symbol of oppression and not, as others might argue, a symbol of humility.
I'm sure that doesn't cover everything. I mean, there's different views, but yeah.
Is there a way to bridge that divide? Like, if you had the ability to do so, uh, do you think that it could be amended in a way to make it acceptable? Is it salvageable, or should it just be, if you could tell the Court of Appeals and probably ultimately the Supreme Court what to do with this legislation, would you tell them just to junk it in its entirety from top to bottom?
Well, you know what? When you ask what I would tell the Supreme Court to do, I guess if I want to look at it in a different way, what would I do if I were on the Supreme Court?
Sure. Let's go with, let's take it. Let's look at it that way.
I'm not sure you would expect my answer, but I would say that um, Quebec chose to enact the legislation invoking the notwithstanding clause in the charter. They have the right to do that, hands off. That's what I would say. I would not overturn the legislation.
Okay.
I think it was I think it's a huge stretch. It was a stretch to say that it violates the equality between the sexes. Yes, there might be a disparate impact on you know female Muslim teachers, but it was actually aimed at everyone. So it's not really about sex inequality, and it's a real stretch to say it's like English language school rights. You know, when I first heard of it, I thought I don't like it, but I didn't think that there was a basis to strike it down. I was surprised that any of the arguments ended up having legs. So I know that that's not really consistent with me saying I don't like it, but I don't like it. But to me, it's their legislation to enact, and you know,
I don't think it is at all inconsistent for you to say, I think this is a bad piece of law, but if I were a judge, my first loyalty is to uphold the law, and according to the law, I wouldn't strike it down. You can. I think that we get far more into problems when a judge would allow a personal preference to overrule what the law says.
yeah, exactly. I mean,
Okay.
whether I like that section of the charter, it's there, and I don't like the idea of stretching, yeah, interpretations to take away something that the charter gave.
So if you were a member of the National Assembly and this law were up for revision, is there something that you would change? Like, what would you change about it, or would you get rid of it altogether?
I'm not sure what I would do. I
Okay.
mean, I don't know the answer. I mean, can you have a law where you encourage people not to, but you don't mandate it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's not really much of a law, then, is it?
No, it's not, and there's not really. I mean, there were some compromises built in. Obviously, the grandfather clause was a big compromise. It
Hmm.
would be, but restricted to the most extreme kind of religious symbols. I don't know, but the inoffensive ones, that just grates me.
All right. Any predictions on how the Court of Appeals and how the Supreme Court will ultimately come down? Since you're a member of neither body.
Well, I would say the Court of Appeal will probably Quebec Court of Appeal will probably uphold it,
Hmm.
based upon what happened last time. Actually, it's an interesting question with the Supreme Court of Canada because they just released a decision a couple of months ago dealing with um, Ontario. Well, Ontario didn't quite invoke it, but they tried to. It's a bit off topic, but it will talk about the thinking of the Supreme Court. So, um, three years ago, it's hard to believe. After Ford's government was elected, they chose to reduce the number of city councillors in Toronto to 25. And there was a huge outcry, and there was a constitutional challenge to that decision. So it initially it was struck down as unconstitutional. Went to the Court of Appeal. They upheld it. They upheld it twice. Actually, first of all they overruled the grand injunction overruling the initial decision. And then ultimately, even though it was moot, it went to a full panel of the Court of Appeal. They upheld it with a dissent. And then it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, who sat on it for a long time. So the decision just came out a couple of months ago. And it was a 5-4 split.
Whoa.
In favor of the government. And so I read it carefully. It was interesting. It was a 5-4 split entirely along the lines of which federal party appointed the judge. It
Really?
was actually an evenly split. So the Harper appointees, all 5 of them, I think they were all Harper appointees, I upheld the decision, said it was not unconstitutional, and the 4 dissenters said that it was. The lead dissenter, Justice Rosalie Abella, actually retired on July 1st at the age of 75, so she's no longer on the bench. But I read the decision with interest, thinking about Bill 21, because the argument in that case, it was a creative argument that the Constitution that there's a so-called an unwritten Constitution. And they tried to argue in favor of the unwritten Constitution as opposed to the written one, which struck me as quite bizarre. and the court said no, we go by the written Constitution. So I think that is a precursor of how they would rule. If the majority had adopted the concept of an unwritten Constitution, then they could just do what they want. They could ignore the words and say, well, there's this notwithstanding clause, but the unwritten Constitution says this.
Okay.
So, it was a very different legal issue. And just to put it in context, is the legal problem was that the Constitution guarantees rights in federal and provincial legislation. It doesn't guarantee the same rights in municipal elections as in federal and provincial ones. And so they were trying to import those rights into a municipal election. And basically the government said, no, the province can do what they want.
Okay.
So that's my long-winded, and sorry for saying that, but of saying that I think that they would do the same here. I think that they would probably uphold it.
All right. Well, thank you. Any other thoughts?
No. Yeah, it's hard to be so long-winded, but I love reading Supreme Court cases and seeing what they're likely to do. I would say there's 3 Quebec judges on the Supreme Court. One of them is quite outspoken. I know how she would. She's the most right-leaning judge on that. I know how she would rule. I probably know how the rest will, and so I think it will probably get upheld. And yeah, that's what I think will happen. Just a guess.
All right. Well, Catherine Francis, thank you very much for being one of the first guests on Centre for Inquiry Canada's new podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today and lending us some of your expertise on this matter.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links related to today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your take on things. The podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed to CFIC, please consider making a donation at centreforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centreforinquiry.ca/join. Your support makes it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reasoned and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. Find us on Facebook and follow CFIC on Twitter at CFI Canada. See you next time.